Hello, all. Welcome to this week's edition of MFP Live. I'm Donna Ladd, the founding editor of the Mississippi Free Press. I'm here as usual with my co-host, Kimberly Griffin, who is the founding publisher of the Mississippi Free Press. Welcome, Kimberly. And our special guest tonight is actually kind of one of my favorite people in the country, Dr. Karen Cox. No pressure, Karen. And Karen is, she is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. She is the author of 4 books. Her past books on the Daughters of the Confederacy, a book about the Goat Castle in Natchez, and most recently, her book, No Common Ground, Confederate Monuments and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice. In other words, Karen is really one of the foremost experts in the country on Confederate groups such as the Daughters of the Confederacy, and as well as Confederate memorials and monuments, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about here tonight. So thank you and welcome, Karen. We're tickled to have you.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be with you. Of course, I would love to be with you in Mississippi, but hopefully not too long.
Well, I know we're getting there, right? Or
Yeah,
in North Carolina, that would be fun too. One of these days, we're all going to be in the same room. But I think Kimberly was going to kind of kick it off for us tonight, I think.
So as 2 Mississippi natives, one of our favorite questions is, how did you get here? First, tell us about your Mississippi background. You studied at Southern.
Yeah.
And how did you become a scholar on the Daughters of the Confederacy and Confederate monuments? How did you end up in this area of study?
Yeah, well, I was a museum professional in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and I was working on, one of my colleagues was a woodworker, and he would salvage wood from the Confederate Women's Home. And that was, he came and said, would you help me research something about, what this home was about? Because I'd like to make up a little card and give it to these items I sell. And I just ended up down a rabbit hole with the United Daughters of the Confederacy. I could tell that, the opening, for example, the opening of the home was such a big affair, public affair, and the women were obviously very involved in this, but also dignitaries from all over the state. And I thought, these are interesting women, and I'd like to know more about them. And so I kind of knew that I was going to study the UDC before I arrived at Southern Mississippi in 1991, I came down to get a PhD in history, and I studied with Marjorie Sproul and also with Neil McMillan. And so I felt like I was in good hands with people who were, first of all, wonderful scholars, but also good writers. And so that's how it started. And And the thing about it is like, I probably have come to Mississippi almost every year since I graduated in '97. And I've continued to mine the state's history for projects that I work on.
Well, Karen, considering that you and I kind of found each other through this, I don't know what I would call anti-lost cause, universe that's out here. Already that I like to refer to myself as kind of a bona fide daughter of the Confederacy, like several times over, but a bit of a fallen one, I will say. So the UDC has always fascinated me and kind of repulses me in some ways, but considering, all of the miseducation and that they have kind of contributed to over the years. So I wanted you to, before we get into the monuments, tell us a little bit about what people you believe as a historian people need to know about these kind of this very strong organization of very kind of innocent seeming Confederate daughters.
Yeah, I think, one of the things, the United Daughters of the Confederacy were formed in 1894, and they had they cast a wide net in terms of what their agenda would be. Monuments obviously is one of them, but they really were about vindicating the Confederacy, vindicating Confederate soldiers, and even their own mothers or grandmothers, anybody supporting the cause. And so they did that through a variety of ways, through history, through monuments, and very importantly through education. And they did that in a variety of ways. So they had an auxiliary, the Children of the Confederacy, but they also placed portraits of Confederate leaders in the classrooms of the public schools, which definitely happened in Mississippi. I actually interviewed a woman in Hattiesburg, said, "Oh, we had portraits of all the generals that we studied." So that they're doing that. There were teachers, public school teachers who were members of the UDC. What's really important, I think, that when you think about these women, it wasn't that they were just memorializing the past. They were actually laying a foundation for the future of the South. And in doing that, that was part of their work with children. That was part of the reason the monuments are there, because they wanted these monuments there as sort of touchstones of the Confederacy and the ideals of the lost cause. Things like, that the South did not fight the war, over slavery. It was about states' rights, and all Confederate veterans are heroes, and all Southern men were, pro-Confederacy. Many of these things could be challenged. And but again, I think they did such a good job, and they monitored textbooks that went into the schools. And they did such an outstanding job that the women that I had studied in that first book, which is really leading up the period of World War I, for generations after, those children grew up to be segregationists. They were, because when you hear some of the language and of segregationists, it's very much lost cause language. It's about preservation of states' rights. And that continues because those things remained in textbooks through the 1970s. And so this is what white children in the South, segregated schools, this is what they learned. And so they were very, very powerful in what they did. And this was, again, you're right. When they got started, this was not a group of, suffragists, although there were suffragists among them, but they were suffrage. Their interest in the vote was about maintaining white supremacy. And so, but this is the thing that they saw, they found power through the UDC. I often say, these women found a career in the UDC. They were educated, middle to upper class women. Two women from Mississippi, Daisy McLaurin Stevens and Lizzie George Henderson, James E. George's daughter. Okay, so they were daughters of senators, and then they rose through the ranks of the UDC to become president over the entire organization. Both of those women in the early part of the 20th century. So they were really powerful, very powerful and influential, and they could get a meeting with the president of the United States when they were in Washington, D.C., which many of them did when William Taft was president.
Let me just factually on that. One of the things that has been so fascinating to me is as I've gone backward to try to understand the history I was never taught. Is it true that the majority of these women were, at least originally, were powerful women who were daughters and of wealth, and in many cases of slaveholding families?
I think some of them definitely were. I think they, they were also, they're very much so, even if their family had lost all the money, right? They were, after the Civil War, they were very much social elites. But they were, I think Daisy McLaurin Stevens was married to a judge. I think he died, but she was widowed. And so she was, that freed her to kind of rise through the ranks. And she was known as a great public orator.
Now, she wasn't who was her father?
Ansel McLaurin.
Who was the great grandfather of Robin Williams. We actually figured that out on a road trip.
Okay.
But
there's not, these connections. Yeah. So
yeah, he was from Brandon here, I think. And McLaurin has long been a big name around Jackson.
That's true.
I didn't know that she was his daughter, though. That's really interesting. Anyway, I would kick it back to you, Kimberly. That I was just
So I want to drill down a little bit more on the women, because I think we can't put too fine a point on that. One of the books that I have not read, but I need to read, is They Were Her Property: White Women as Slave Owners in the American South.
Right.
Right. I have not read it, but I have heard her do a couple of lectures on the History Channel. And one of the things one of the stories she talks about is this idea that white women were benignly adjacent to the system of owning human beings.
Right.
That this idea, and if you're in charge of the narrative, if you're the Daughters of the Confederacy, then you can create that narrative. And it was interesting, and you guys may remember this story a little bit better than I do. There's a woman who was, for the matriarch of the family, she was the one that ran this large enslaved persons. They owned many enslaved persons, and people thought it was her nephew that was the boss, because he was the one they saw at the slave market. But then they went and got her letters, and he was not. He just was the runner. And so there's this idea, and that idea continues today. This idea that, that we had no agency over ourselves, so we had no agency over what was happening, so we couldn't control it. Tell us how that served that population, that narrative, it wasn't us, and we were just here. And
right. Well, I mean, it works because first, it works for all white Southerners to say this wasn't about slavery, right? We wouldn't have, fought a war for something like that, an institution of the institution of slavery. So it works for that, but it also part of it's about, the whole myth of Southern womanhood, that we don't sully ourselves with those kinds of things, and so it works for them too, even as they, after the Civil War, and they become first members of the Ladies Memorial Associations, and then members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And I mean, part of their agenda, again, as I said, is to vindicate their family members, so they're trying to vindicate, to kind of wash away the stain of slavery. Right. And that benefits them, 2 generations later, to have that. And even as they are part of an entire system of white supremacy in the years after the Civil War. That's the thing. I think people, I'm thinking, when I first wrote about the United Daughters of the Confederacy, women's history had not been focusing in on women's role in these kinds of, it was always this narrative of, of feminism, right? And it's interesting because if I were to say to you, these women were great fundraisers, great speakers, they lobbied their state legislators, you would think I might be talking about suffragists,
right?
Because they certainly benefited from the ways in which women's lives changed after the Civil War. But I think it's important to understand that women are just as invested in white supremacy as men are. This protects that the fact in the 1890s, when there's this, disfranchisement going on throughout the South, that begins with the Mississippi Plan. There's an epidemic of lynching going on in the 1890s. That's the very decade the UDC is born, because by eliminating men from public spaces, from the political sphere, that it just it opens this door through which these white women can walk in and have public lives and not, fear the black beast, right? The way that they,
Right.
would talk about them is these black men in these spaces they're terrified of, right? So they're working in tandem with the white men in the South, as white men are passing legislation to disfranchise men, and then further to legalize segregation. In this period, and then these women are supplanting that culturally through their history, through education, through the monuments that land on the grounds of courthouses. So they're all part of the system.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Wow.
when I was doing working on a story that I did with John McGee last year about Mississippi State and about Stephen D. Lee, and so I ran into a lot of this. And in some ways, he was the founder, or really helped found with J.Z. George and some others, Mississippi State University. He was the first president. I'm a graduate of Mississippi State University. His bust was on my my college invitation, as my graduation, as I realized recently. But a lot of what you're talking about is wrapped around his story. He married into this wealthy family in Columbus, Mississippi, and then became a Confederate officer. And then you talk about vindicating, Karen. One of the things that was so interesting and around that was, and I know you're well acquainted with this as a historian, but that they part of what was going on is that they were the Southerners, the Confederates, particularly the officers and the planters and such, former planters, were trying to win in the South too, because they had a lot of Southerners who weren't happy about how that Civil War went, right? And so part of this whole vindication was to say that the whole thing was honorable. But at the same time, I wanted to mention this before we get away from it. He supported women's suffrage when he was in the legislature and such, not because because they needed more white people voting than the black people who could then vote. I mean, it was a math issue. This now shouldn't be surprising to us. It just wasn't taught to us in our history. And this is a man who's still honored, by my alma mater in all kinds of ways. Now, they didn't pass women's suffrage at that point, but it was his stated reason for supporting women's suffrage. And his wife was part of UDC, there, and helped set up the statues in Columbus. I mean, that's what I mean. It was this whole universe that played out over and over again. And then they were both involved in the rewriting of the textbooks.
Yeah.
So I kick back to you. I kind of tell that story to let Mississippians know how close at hand and relevant all of this is to us. But this was playing out all over the South, right?
Right.
Talk about that. It was all tied together, what they were doing.
Yeah, it's playing out everywhere. The UDC gets to be, by World War I, 100,000 members in the UDC. And Mississippi's was probably one of the largest divisions of the UDC. And so, but it's going on everywhere across the South. And it becomes almost like a competition among women to see how many monuments they could put up, how many children they could register in the Children of the Confederacy.
Ew. I mean, I know that's a thing, but it's still hurts to hear them. Yeah.
Yeah, no. And so there was a woman in Aberdeen. I'm sorry, I can't remember her name right now, but she supposedly, won this prize, one of these silver cups they would give for registering the most children of the Confederacy. And she had registered 500 children. I was like, how is that possible in a town the size of Aberdeen?
Good Lord. And what would the
and that would have been like a quarter of the population of Aberdeen. And so what I realized is that what she had done was not only registered who was there, but as soon as a baby was born, she registered them. And then anyone who had a tie to Aberdeen, she registered those children. And so they might not have actually been living there, but it was just so competitive. And this was like, again, being in the UDC was like a big deal. for these women, and so that's why they get into this kind of competition. But yes, this is a region-wide thing, like so. But the UDC operates locally most of the time, and most in their local communities. Then they have their annual, state conventions, and then there's the general convention of the entire UDC, and that's where, like I said, some of those women, like Daisy McLaurin Stevens, and what's the other one's name, Henderson, rise through the ranks, and it's like a position of power. To be president of the UDC was huge. Because you could decide, what are the projects of the organization going to be. You could, tap your, people who, who were going to kind of be your quote unquote generals. And that was the name. They were known as, that's the titles of their officers: President General, Vice President General, Historian General. There's like these military titles. And so, that kind of imbues what they were doing with some power.
And wasn't it true that their stated goals was to make sure that this history goes forward for generations, that their version, their false version of this glorifying history.
Yeah. So that was in their constitution from the beginning. They said, we want to perpetuate these ideals onto what they said the third and fourth generation, because at that time they were the second, right? So they meant to their children and their grandchildren, but it was, you could just keep adding that in there, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, in perpetuity. So, so they really had an eye on the future, which is why, not only are this children of the Confederacy in this educational program, but children are very much involved in the rituals of monument unveilings and annual rituals of Confederate Memorial Day, or they would take children down to Beauvoir, make them, they create little fruit baskets or whatever it might be, and go down and sit with these old men and I think in women, because there were women in the home in Mississippi both. So they were introducing these children to these Confederates, former Confederates. So
one quick thing there, and then I'll kick it back to Kimberly. The when I was researching I've been road tripping and taking pictures of all these monuments all over the state, and the one in Raymond, I was reading about it, and then the one in Columbus, and I know this isn't unusual, but the first time I read it, it was kind of shocking to me, because when they unveiled it, the monument, like they would have these huge ceremonies with all these Confederate officers and these crowds and crowds of people, right? But the children would do the unveiling in many cases. Isn't that part of that kind of ceremony, right?
Yeah, it's very much part of the ritual. It's to connect past generations to future generations, to select a child who pulls the rope and, that reveals the monument. The children are also often, and like in many cases, form what they call a living battle flag. The children are dressed up in the colors of a Confederate flag, and they're arranged like a battle flag on the stands. Children will be part of the parade. They would sing songs, and then there were often these 13 little girls dressed all in white with a sash that represent the states, each state of the former Confederacy. So there was so much ritualization around monuments and their unveiling. And it was it was a community event. It was like every white person in the community was there. And, it's hard to know. It's like, you don't see these in photographs, like what was that like for African Americans to have to be in the community while that was going on. But we do know, for example, that in many cases, they would use Black laborers to prepare, the foundation for these monuments.
Wow. So I'm going to just shift gears just a tiny bit. One of the things I discovered in our, well, I didn't discover it. My cousins, the genealogist, discovered it. I just am that I have two great grandfathers that got Confederate pensions. That because they were servants in the infantry. Servants being that they were they were enslaved and they were with the people that were enslaved them. And you used to have to print that in the newspaper when you got a pension, which was interesting to me, but that's how we found all this out. That's just a tidbit of history that I'm still coming to grappling with. But as a person of color who's probably been half the institutions, I went to public school, went to public universities, I went to University of Southern Mississippi. I would imagine that half of the places I have dwelled in that are public institutions were named after a member of the Confederacy. And it wasn't until I was probably in my late 30s, early 20s that I even had a concept about that. I don't know if that was intentional. I'm sure it was intentional at my elementary school. I think they purposefully deleted the person's name from my history because it was all Black elementary school. So I still struggle with that knowledge. Another book that I need to read is Ty, and I don't know, Sadul. Am I saying this right now? Sadul.
I've never had to say it. I know who you're talking about.
He's the brigadier general that wrote Robert E. Lee and Me, A Southerner's Reckoning. And one of the things he talks about is when he moved to Georgia, they weren't in Georgia. That's not true. When he was in Virginia, he was part of the public school system, and they desegregated the school system, and he got bused across town to Robert E. Lee to Robert E. Lee Elementary School. And he said, and this was the Black school, and he was so thrilled to be going to Robert E. Lee Elementary School because Robert E. Lee was his hero. And he said later on, he kind of realized, as he reflected, that nobody else knew who Robert E. Lee was really, except him. The other white kids knew, but probably his Black friends didn't know. So talk about, you mentioned in the book that in the early 2000s that there was a resurgence. A resurgence may not be a word, but a push to erect or remember a lot of these monuments. And to me, that's obviously not coincidental.
Yeah. So So I think what people would find surprising, well, a couple of things. One is that monuments have been built in every decade since the end of the Civil War, number one. And that since 2000, there have been 35 new monuments. That's a lot. They would, and they might be on private property, on battlefields, maybe state battlefield parks, things like that. But that there have been that many, or even in a cemetery. But they're not, they haven't been publicly funded unless perhaps they're getting, if they're being maintained, if they're at a park or something like that. Nothing along the lines of what the UDC did in the early 20th century when they were landing on the grounds of state courthouses and state capitals. What I saw happening really is that, between the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and then the progress that had been made politically by African Americans being able to elect people that looked like them in their city council, et cetera. In the 90s, you see this start to see this pushback against that, and you see the rise of the League of the South, which is a neo-Confederate organization, and then you've seen many of splinter groups since the 1990s, and it's like, I think when I think about monuments, I think about them as these things that are never static. They're always, for many people, they see like messages in these monuments, whether you defend them or you would like to have them removed. They send out particular messages, and so that little switch in the 1990s, I think, is like marked a new, like, a beginning of this kind of pushback against the racial progress that had been made since the Voting Rights Act. You begin the very, the beginnings of gerrymandering in the 1990s, what they call affirmative gerrymandering, where you still can elect a Black official, but in one district, but the rest of them are all going to, they're guaranteed one Black representative, but everyone else, as Angie Maxwell, who I talked with about this, who wrote a book called The Long Southern Strategy. She says every other district would be, as she said, bleached white. In other words, you can have one and that's all you get, right? 1994 is an interesting year because it's also the, when the takeover of the Republicans take over Congress and come in with their contract with America. I mean, there's a lot happening there. And I think a lot of this is a backlash to the progress that had been made, since voting rights. So the monuments that were built since 2000, again, I think most of them, the way you should think about Confederate monuments since 2000 is that for most of the first decade of the 21st century, it remained a regional discussion, debate, etc. Right. And then with the 2015 Charleston massacre, it became a national debate, right? It was no longer just about the region. At some point, it's like politicians had to be careful. Someone like Rick Perry, who was being considered for, as a presidential candidate in 2012, didn't necessarily promote his Confederate bona fides, right. In terms of his defense, because that would not necessarily sell well outside of the South. But in 2015, those things changed, and that, when South Carolina took the Confederate battle flag off the grounds of the state capitol, conservatives, right wingers, they said, their alarm bells went off, and then yes, you began to see them passing monument laws. North Carolina, where I live, was the first. Within a month after those people were murdered in that church, North Carolina passed a monument law to protect that, because that's what they thought was happening. It's like, oh, they're going to come for the monuments now, right? That's the thing. And then other states are, follow suit. Georgia's just passed in 2019, and then just this year, just in April, Florida passed what they call an anti-riot law, anti-protest law, but embedded in that law is a monuments, protecting monuments, creating additional penalties for vandalizing a monument and making a second-class felony to rip a monument down, and with a potential 15-year prison sentence. So, wow. And I'm actually thinking, I'm working on something I hope to put out about that, to say, and basically this push against, I hope you're probably hearing lawnmowers over here. Sorry, it's like, oh, now you want to mow. It's like anyway, so what I was going to say is that anytime there's a little bit of progress, there's a pushback, and somehow Confederate iconography is involved. It just is. The League of the South uses Confederate iconography. This is all about pushing back against African-American progress, multiculturalism, et cetera, et cetera. And then, South Carolina passed in 2000 its monument law, because after the NAACP boycott had worked so well and forced them to take the battle flag off the Capitol and then put it on the grounds of the state capitol and off the dome, they passed a law, and it's their version of a monument law, and they actually made the battle flag a monument, which was and it created this situation where you have to have a super majority in the legislature to even change that law. So both houses, will have to approve of that by 2/3 majority, and so making it impossible, right? Which is why they were even after those people were, murdered in the church in Charleston, there was still debating that, in the days after. So I think people thought, oh, if you can remove a Confederate battle flag off the Capitol grounds of South Carolina, we better they perked their ears up and they realized that this was something that might play well with their constituents nationally, because people didn't understand it, not necessarily, so, people think, oh, why would anybody want to move a monument? It's only about heritage, and not really understanding the longer history of what these statues have meant in the South.
Well, and we have, we have the same problem in Mississippi. I mean, and one of the things you write about in your book is that this is a local issue, ultimately, that people have to make decisions locally about what they want to do. But these monument laws actually make it difficult to make local decisions.
Exactly.
So we've got, you know how it is. I mean, I've been visiting these monuments. I mean, they're in these towns that are crumbling across the state, in many cases that have suffered major white flight since school integration, when people fled at least to the country or the suburbs. So you got these statues sitting here in some cases, 70, 80, 90% Black towns with language on them in some cases that are glorifying, that are just horrible language. Some of the language is more about the deaths of the soldiers, as you write about. Some it's about the cause, right?
Right.
But so you have places like, Greenville, Mississippi, which has been decimated by white flight and disinvestment and all these things. And, so they can vote to move their statue, but it's just this matter of whether they can get it moved, whether they can pay for it, whether they can get past the monument law. I mean, it's all these things. So there's no local control to that at all. People run out of these cities and then they tell them they can't move the statues.
Yeah, and it's like, to me, it's like the most anti-Southern thing ever is to take away local control. That's the way the South is built on, like, maintaining local control, And so the state, and then the state kind of, removes that, takes that away. Yeah. So, and then protects them. And basically what's interesting about, is that these quote unquote, they're not they call them monument laws, but also heritage protection acts.
Yeah.
These heritage protection acts really aren't protecting any heritage really, unless it's a heritage of white supremacy. It's not it's not, definitely not the heritage of any kind of Civil War veteran, but actually these laws don't protect, they actually lead to vandalism. Because what's happened is that people out of frustration feel like, well, there's no, even if a local community wanted to move it, they can't. I can't, because of gerrymandering and any number of other types of voter suppression that's out there. And it's like, well, I can't elect an official who might actually represent my point of view on this topic. I can't, so I have no legal recourse, unless, maybe an attorney's willing to take it on, which there are people out there, and I've talked to some of them. So I do know that there may be challenges, legal challenges, but for the average person, they feel like so frustrated and like, what is my recourse, And this is, so you saw what you saw last summer after George Floyd murder, is, the protests, erupted, and one of the ways that, people responded was to vandalize these monuments. They just, and now they're, like if the Florida law, which is real punitive, continue, if I can see, if there's a possibility other states may follow suit and make it like that, it's just going to be nearly impossible. But it's all, a response to shut down movements for racial justice.
Right. Because if these outward-facing symbols are taken down, then that is one part of your attack plan that doesn't exist anymore. We know, moving to kind of to another point, We know that white-owned media and newspapers play a huge role in attracting crowds for lynchings, even announcing them in advance. They were pretty celebratory about these statues, and I encourage anyone, there is a book, and I'll try to find the name of it, that features these photos. They're hard to watch. There were postcards showing people having picnics. People would make a day of it. How can media today reverse that legacy? Are they?
How can they? Yeah. I guess it depends on which media outlet you're looking at, right? I mean, it's just the thing. People choose, maybe they choose their own echo chambers. I don't know. I mean, as a historian, I try to write public pieces for the media because I really want to educate people about this issue.
Right.
I know there was just a piece published yesterday in ProPublica by a journalist from the News and Observer about the whole situation and the longer history in Graham, North Carolina, and Alamance County, where there's this like rough, tumble sheriff, who's going to put down these rioters and stuff. But because again, they're being peaceful, but then these laws or stuff, like, they kind of put the power back in the hands of law enforcement and let them make the decision as to whether or not that's peaceful or riotous, and so that's an unfortunate. But I know that there are people, the media's out there, is on this issue, but whether or not people are listening is another thing. I just we all got work to do, right? Like I have my little piece of stuff that I do, that I push back, and I try to, provide people with the proper historical context and bringing the evidence of what I'm writing about, as you do. And I think that, who gets, the thing is, it's like I was reading something, that the historian Heather Cox Richardson, who has this, platform when she writes her letters from an American, and she says, even though Biden, for example, is doing, really good things, what's, sucking all the air out of the room, or the, what's going on in Congress and these battles about, whether or not there's going to be an investigation into January 6th. And so I think very similarly around these issues, you find that, we can write about them, et cetera, but you might get, you get a soundbite from a politician. You'll get somebody like Ron DeSantis, and who says, who signs something into law and makes a big thing of it, and he's getting more of the press than those who are actually, maybe making some progress on this issue. So, it's a challenging time to even talk about race, I mean, we just saw what happened here in North Carolina with Nicole Hannah-Jones. You have a board of governors that are political appointees by the state legislature. It didn't used to be that way. It used to be that the governor of the state appointed people to the Board of Higher Education. But in 2008, when there was a Republican takeover and all this, they basically took that out of the hands of the governor. So we're in a moment of minority rule. The small group, because it's not, if you all know. I mean, I know about my own state. It's like, my state is much more diverse than it looks like on paper, right? Then it looks like in terms of the way in which the state is represented. And so for on the issue of Confederate monuments, it's like, there are clearly local communities are willing to do something. One of the things North Carolina has is this loophole, which the governor used to remove monuments at the state capitol last summer, was that if they become objects of there's a concern of public safety around those monuments, then they can be removed by the local community, and that's happened. And then you have Asheville, God bless Asheville. Asheville's such like the weirdest town in our state, but I love it. so I'm not sure what have to investigate this more, but not only did they bring down the Vance Monument, he was the Confederate governor of North Carolina, and there's this big stone monument obelisk in the town square of Asheville.
I've seen it. Yep.
Right. Not only were they going to take it down, and they started taking it down this week, but they were going to destroy it.
You're going to pulverize it.
I just don't know how that happened. I said, well, for people that are upset about it, I just said, because it's all made out of local stone, and I thought they're just returning it to the earth, just recycling it.
Wow.
But then, just up the road from me is this town of Salisbury, North Carolina. There's this monument that was right on the main thoroughfare, and the local council, the city council worked out a deal with the UDC, and they moved the monument to the local cemetery. So I think there is, possibilities in some instances around these things, and in different towns have worked through it some, but those laws really do get in the way, and if they're gonna keep putting more teeth in them, then it's gonna make it harder and harder. But again, to me, the way I think about Confederate monuments in general, I know I've written this longer history of the monuments, but it's really, to me, it's about where we are as a nation, that those monuments represent the racial divisiveness.
Yes.
And the fact that there is no common ground on what people believe they mean.
That's right.
So in some ways, the argument isn't over whether or not you remove the monument. The argument is about race, and is about how we're divided.
And it's also about what we've learned. And I think to me, that's where this comes full circle, because not only did they put up the monuments, but they did the very same groups, whether it was UDC or the Sons of Confederate Veterans, ultimately, or United Confederate, whatever. Originally, they did this miseducation forward for all of us. And this is kind of the point that I try to break through with people, that they lied to us about this history. And over and over again, so that we keep hiding the realities like they wanted us to hide. And I'll be honest with you, we might have been related to some of these people, but we didn't know them. Like, I don't know my Confederate folks or my grandmothers who owned slaves.
Right.
I didn't know them. So I don't have to honor what they did. And
right. I think we all make choices about that, right? It's like when I lived in Mississippi, and I would go and meet and talk with members of the UDC because I wanted to interview them for the book. And I'm originally from West Virginia. Okay. But I grew up in North Carolina. Like my family moved there when I was very young, like 10 years old. Anyway. But I know from doing genealogy that I have both a Confederate ancestor and a Union one.
Yeah. Right.
A federal, and, so, those things never meant much to me, and I never thought too much about them, not in the way that, some people, subscribe to this particular heritage. And so, but I can see the way it works, and the way it works, to keep people invested in these statues, over, and think that somehow that, removing a monument is somehow a destruction of them personally. I think they take these things very personal. I don't see it that way. I'm just like, I can look at something and say, you know what, that's wrong. I know that doesn't represent who I am. I don't think, and I couldn't, even if I had an ancestor who fought for the Confederacy. I mean, bottom line, as a historian, I know that the war was about slavery.
Right.
Period.
Right.
There's no discussion about that. And and let's just be clear, if they go away, we haven't lost history. History has not been erased. We can always discover the history of these monuments, even if they didn't exist. We know that they exist through photographs, through postcards, through speeches. any number of things. And so I think people need to understand. I mean, I'm a historian. I'm often researching things that no longer exist,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I can find out that history.
Mm-hmm.
So history is not being erased.
No.
What it would happen would be a divisive symbol of Jim Crow would be being removed, you know.
Right.
And they shouldn't be. I'm like, I've said this since 2015 after the Charleston massacre. They do not belong in democratic spaces,
No.
public square, whatever.
Look,
you
if
know.
Beauvoir wants to take them all and put them
Yeah.
on, now they get tax money, but that's another subject.
They get state funding.
Right, but still, if there are things that you could do without destroying these monuments if you love them that much. You can
you can take them into your home if you so wish.
That's
but
right.
They must leave this public space.
I
That's
say
right.
to people all the time, historic preservationists know this. It's just like, you want to save a building or whatever. It's just like you raise the money and you move it and preserve it. So if you really believe and love these monuments so much, you're worried about them, then raise the money and move them, and so you can protect them and preserve them.
If that's
if that's what it's really about, but it's not what it's about.
No, it's very important to them that they sit there and be beacons and send these messages.
It's terroristic.
That's
what it is.
Yeah.
That's it in the middle of the street in Brandon.
Right.
It's like right there that you have to drive around it, or in Louisville.
Right.
Go ahead, Kimberly. I'm sorry.
A side note, I was one of my middle school teachers. Her family she married into a family that was, she's dead now, I can say it. They were the champions, and they refused to let them reenact Civil War battles on the part of land they own because they thought that was horrific. Like, they were like, why would you reenact a battle? That's crazy. But she also said, well, the Civil War wasn't really about slavery to her mixed race classroom. So this is someone that she was repeating what she'd been told, but she had seen through the fog enough to know reenacting a battle is not something that is it serves our community. But so I said all this to say, I feel like if she'd met or read something you had written, Dr. Cox, she would have seen life a different way. You're in academia, you're encountering our young people, you are going around the country. Well, before the pandemic, you were going around the country. Now you're coming from your living room, talking to folks. Are there any people whose minds have been changed?
Yes.
Tell us about, let's end on a positive note. Tell us what you're hearing when they read your book, or when they go to your class, or when they go to hear you talk. What are you hearing from those folks? What they know, what they thought they knew, and what they learned?
Well, I mean, in my class, I taught a course on Confederate monuments last spring, and we had to stop meeting, of course, because of the pandemic. But the students did these wonderful research papers and on individual monuments. That was their assignment. And I think, and they told me at the beginning of the class that one of the things that they learned about the Civil War that was from their high schools was that it was about states' rights.
Yeah.
So I have to clear that up. When I go to speak, the last talk I gave was in Morganton, North Carolina, which is kind of between here and Asheville in the mountains, foothills of the mountains. It's a small community, much smaller than Charlotte, and there was definitely some, pro-Trump element in the audience that were there to try to intimidate me. But at the end of the talk, a woman came over to me on her walker. She had to have been in her 80s.
Wow.
And I thought, she's going to tell me, something about her ancestor or something, And she said to me, you changed my mind.
Wow.
And that was one of the most powerful things that had ever happened there, to me. I was like, I was completely thrown off by that. So that was an individual instance. But I'm going to say that one of the things that I've noticed that has changed for me, especially I think since writing this book, and even before I wrote the book, was that I've been speaking to community organizations that are interracial groups. I spoke to a group in Louisville, Kentucky, and that was organized by a white attorney and an African American minister, and that was a crowd of 200 people that was mixed, represented a cross section of the community. And then the Morganton talk was organized by a Presbyterian minister. The way that they had about 200 people there, and the way that they knew about it was it circulated through their churches. And then just this year, since the book has come out, one of the first groups I spoke to was the North Carolina Council of Churches. I do believe that there are people out there who have not committed to any particular narrative, who say and whose minds are open enough to say, I want to learn about this. I want to discuss it. I've learned a certain thing a certain way. Maybe they have Confederate ancestor or whatever, but they also regard it as a social justice issue or a racial justice issue. And so I'm encouraged by that people of faith are saying, hey, we want to know more, and and what can we do, and so I don't know, and so I know that there are always going to be people that say, let's remove them all, and then over here on the other side is don't dare touch them. I'm not going to be like, I'm not talking to them because they're convinced one way or the other. What I am trying to do with the book is reach people in the middle who really don't know the history. Their minds are open to learn, and they're open to learning the history. And maybe their minds will be changed by reading about it. This isn't just, they can't just like have a knee-jerk reaction to a Black Lives Matter protest. If they read the history and understood that protest is not new, that goes back all the way to the 19th century, well over 100 years ago. This is not a new phenomenon.
Well, the thing, look, I agree with you. And I want to add to that, Hope, very quickly. I cannot tell you how many people, white people, have walked up to me in the grocery store, have got in touch for 20 years and said that getting the new information in whatever way has changed their mind. And a lot of them are pissed off. Yeah, this is a story I did for The Guardian that's exactly about this. A lot of them are pissed off because they were lied to all those years. And so the truth is, we can't assume that they're just two sides. I can understand the cynicism, and Kimberly, I totally get it, and it's not really your job to try to convince these people. I get that too. It kind of is mine. And I think Karen takes, to get the information in front of people so that they can see what the truth really is, and that we have been lied to, and for really bad reasons, to cover up atrocities and all those other things that we could talk about more another time. But wow, I mean, we have so many questions we could continue to ask you, Karen. You knew you were getting into this with us. I know. Tell them about the book festival you're going to be at in Jackson.
Yeah, I'm like so excited to be coming back to the Mississippi Book Festival in August this year. Looking forward to seeing friends and making new ones. And so I'll be here to sweat right along with you.
It is. It's a hot time of the year.
It is a hot time, but it's a great book festival, and I'm pleased that they asked me to participate. For those who are watching, like, you should know that there's a good chunks of the book that deal with Mississippi and talk about monuments in Mississippi and the Meredith March and the ways in which people confronted those monuments along that march. So again, I'm always mining the state for history because it's such a rich a pool of information about all kinds of historical topics. And so I'm excited to come back and hope I'll meet both of you in person.
I know, right? We never have.
I hope so too.
And just so people know that she did a book excerpt for us a few weeks back when the book came out that is about the Meredith March and the pushback in Grenada and in Greenwood, I believe, that protest against the monuments. And it's a wonderful piece. So I'll go and tweet it out
Great,
so,
great.
so that y'all can go read that piece, because I meant to ask her about it, but we never got there. So thank you everybody so much for joining us for another episode of MFP Live, and especially Karen Cox. Oh, we are announcing we are in the middle of our Truth to Power campaign to raise funds for this nonprofit media outlet. And team members of the MFP, staff members, have put together pledge donations now of $1,500 for our next match. And we're officially starting that right now until we get for our next 1,500 as we head toward our July 1st deadline. So we're over 2/3 of the way to our $100,000 goal. So you guys go throw a little bit of money at mfp.ms.donate or /donate. You saw it on the screen. Anyway, thank you. Thanks for producers. And help us continue doing this amazing work so that we can keep talking to remarkable people like Karen Cox. We so appreciate all of you. Next week, who we got up, Kimberly?
We have Shamika Reed, who is the founder and creator of the Young Gifted and Empowered Awards, which honors Mississippians, Black Mississippians under 45.
So Shamika will be with us next Thursday night at 6 p.m. And y'all share this because the recording will still be out there. And have a wonderful weekend all. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.